All right.
All right, y'all. I do see two more people coming in.
Oh,
yeah. The tardy ones.
Well, that's good, because it's just me talking for a minute, so.
Oh.
Okay, thank you all so much for joining us this evening. I am a bookseller here, and I, along with the whole Left Bank Books team, welcome you to Left Bank Books. Please help me in welcoming Robert P. Baird and in conversation with Ciera Horton McElroy. Right, we will be celebrating Robert's Bobby. Bobby, all right.
Yeah.
We'll be celebrating Bobby. We're all friends here, yeah. Highly acclaimed debut novel, The Nimbus. At once a rollicking intellectual satire, a searing portrait of a family in crisis, and a thrilling metaphysical page-turner, The Nimbus offers a comic and profound examination of the persistence of spiritual belief in the secular age and humanity's examination for meaning. Tonight, Bobby Baird will be in conversation with St. Louis author Ciera Horton McElroy to discuss these themes in more detail. And some notes before we begin. Tonight's event is possible because of your support. When you support Left Bank Books, your money goes directly into the local economy, funding your streets, parks, and more. And it also helps writers get the support they deserve and allows us to produce events such as this. So thank you for shopping local. And if you enjoyed tonight, please know that Left Bank Book plans new events for readers of all ages all year round. Next week, we welcome Amani Roberts to discuss his new book that is a historical and cultural analysis of the power, passion, and pain in R&B groups. And that's on Tuesday. It's here, it's free, and it's at 6 o'clock. And if that sounds compelling, please join us. And if it doesn't sound compelling, please check out our website because we have so many other events. Okay, and for tonight's event, our guests are Bobby Baird and Ciera McElroy. Bobby grew up in Northern California, studied mechanical engineering and human biology at Stanford, and earned a PhD from the University of Chicago's Divinity School.
You did?
Yeah, sociology. He has worked as an editor for The New Yorker, for Harper's Magazine, The Paris Review, Chicago Review, and Esquire, and has published journalism, essays, and reviews in those magazines and other outlets. He currently lives in Brooklyn with his wife and kids, and The Nimbus is his first novel. And Ciera is the author of Atomic Family, named a 2023 Great Group Read by the Women's National Book Association, and was shortlisted for the VCU Cable First Novelist Award. She lives in the Midwest, where she writes and runs a boutique film marketing agency. And tonight's book, I'm just going to quote Nell from the author of The Limit. The Nimbus. She said, "I think that there are miracles in the world, but realistic novels don't usually tackle them. Baird's intelligence, compassion, and humor illuminates this astonishing original debut, which somehow manages to ask hard questions about how to live while also being enormously fun to read." Well, thank you so much for listening to me for so long. Without further ado, while y'all are here, let's give another warm welcome to Robert Baird.
I'm going to do this first part standing up. Okay, I'm going to do this first part standing up, and then when I talk to Ciera, we'll remove this. Do the next part sitting down again. Everyone hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, great. I hate reading from my phone, but I didn't have a chance to practice yet, so forgive me. I'm going to say a little bit in the beginning here. Basically, the form of what I'll do tonight, I'm going to read to you from the book for about just 15 minutes or so. And then Ciera and I will talk for maybe another 15 or 20 minutes, and then we will take questions. So if you have questions, please feel free to store them away for that. First of all, I want to thank Left Banks for having me. As Rose said, the importance of bookstores, and especially independent bookstores for writers, and writers like me, can't be overstated. So please support them any way you can, especially because, as you all know better than I do, apparently there's a big storm that came through here. They said that they escaped relatively unscathed, but I'm sure they would appreciate any support. And if you need an idea for books to buy, obviously The Nimbus is one of them, but also I highly recommend Ciera's book, Atomic Family, which I've just started reading on the way down on the train. It's a terrific book. about a family that lives in a bomb-making town during the Cold War. Started, I'm super hooked on it already, so please check that out as well. Before I get to the book, I just did want to say a few short words about what we're doing here and kind of how it relates to the rest of the country. I feel extremely privileged to be able to publish a book right now in 2025. I'm 47 years old. I waited a long time to be able to do this, but I'm also highly conscious of the fact that there's a lot of stuff going on in the country right now. In California, as you may know, the president has called up the Marines, National Guard to suppress protests. Those protests are against his immigration policies, and those immigration policies follow on a lot of stuff that is attacking things that are very dear to me, among vaccines, free thinking universities, independent law firms, the whole raft of things. At first blush, there's not much connection between my book, which is a book about a glowing toddler on the south side of Chicago, and all of that stuff. It's not a political book in any explicit way, or even really, you have to dig pretty deep to make it political, I think. But it is a book that I think, and I hope, will have something to say about what I see, at least, as a pretty profound crisis of meaning in the country. It's a book that's about kind of how we approach and how we ask some of the big questions that we used to look to religion for. And I grew up Catholic. I'm still kind of vaguely Catholic. But, I think for a lot of people right now, questions like, what are we doing here? What's the point of all this? Are still sort of live and still very much harassing us, and we don't exactly know how to answer them. So in my mind, at least, that's the kind of thin thread that connects one to the other. It is a book that is really for people who find themselves saying, like, I hope everyone loves it, of course, but I think it's especially pertinent for people who maybe are religious or not religious, but still find themselves coming back to these big questions and don't really know what to do with them. It's not a book that's going to try to convert you to any particular faith or any particular doctrine, so you don't have to worry about proselytation. And I do want to say it is a novel. It's a story. It's like things happen. There's even a little bit of action in it. So I don't want to scare you away. It's not just like all big ideas and that's it. Okay. What I'm going to do, the book has four main characters. As I told you, it's a book about a glowing toddler. Two of the main characters are that toddler's parents. One of them is a professor at a divinity school on the south side of Chicago. His name is Adrian Bennett. His wife's name is Renata Bennett. She runs a freelance nonprofit consultancy. Another of the characters is a graduate student named Paul Harkin, who is a graduate student of Adrian's. And then there's a third character, and you'll hear about those three tonight. There's a third character named Warren Kaida, who's a librarian at the university. He kind of comes in a little bit out of left field at the beginning, very quickly joins the mainstream of the story. But the section I have for him is a little bit longer, and I'm going to get to our conversation, so I'm not going to read that part tonight. So what I'll do is I'll read a section about Paul, and then I'll jump ahead to another section about Renata and Adrian and how they met each other and fell in love, and that'll give you kind of a sense of the book and this stuff. He was on fire. Adrian's son was on fire. That, at any rate, was what it looked like the first time Paul Harkin saw, well, the first time he saw whatever it was. Luca Bennett, a burly, bubbly 2-year-old with gray eyes that drooped a little in the corners and a rumpled haystack of yellow hair atop his oversized head, was sleeping soundlessly in a jogger stroller in the corner of his father's office, and he looked like he was on fire. It was not a big fire, to be sure, not a bright fire, certainly not a blaze or conflagration, more like the flame you see on the underside of a broiler, something low and close. At once lucent and translucent, it traced Luca's baby fat contours in 3 dimensions and extended a half-inch or so into space, dissolving into wispy filaments that rustled according to a rhythm that appeared impervious to the motion of the air around them. To Paul, that first time, the light appeared deep yellow, Later, others would say that they saw it as blue, or pink, or even clear, like the fumes from an open gas tank. One woman compared it to the radiant fuzz that clings to the outer edge of a lit neon tube. A college sophomore said it reminded him of a dense and luminous fog, of the sort that settles onto a city after the rain in the lamplit dead of night. A little girl said the glow looked like the stuff that seeped out when you popped a firefly open between the nails of your thumb and forefinger, while her mother said that she was put in mind of the blue blur of atmosphere you see in photos of Earth taken from space. A man who'd lost his eyesight 30 years earlier in a boiler explosion swore up and down that he could see Luca in a sort of reverse silhouette as he moved. The boy's entire tiny being, the man said, appeared to pulse, flare, and churn in tempestuous whirls, like the movies he remembered watching that showed the roiling surface of the sun. The day Paul first saw the Nimbus, which was the first time anyone saw it, was an ordinary Thursday in mid-October. It was a few weeks before his 28th birthday, a little less than a month after the start of a new academic term. By some measures, it was not that long ago, but it was far enough back that Paul and his friends still had every reason to believe that George W. Bush would be the worst president they'd see in their lifetimes. That fall, Paul was arcing high in the weightless apogee of life. He was in his 6th year as a graduate student at the Divinity School of a well-respected but not particularly well-known university on Chicago's South Side. 6 years, call it 5 even, if you only wanted to credit time served, was longer than anything else he'd done in his life. Longer than high school, longer than college, far longer than all his post-collegiate jobs put together. 5 years of serious business, the length of world wars and Soviet economic plans. 5 years is what it took Justinian to build the Hagia Sophia, or Flaubert to write Madame Bovary. Paul had done nothing nearly so impressive with his time at the university. Nevertheless, he wore all the marks of an able young man at the peak of life. Dense black hair that crowded close to his dense black eyebrows, sturdy shoulders and calves traversed by visible, vigorous blood vessels, joints that never ached for no reason, and a bladder that let him sleep unmolested for 10 long hours at a stretch. He had dark eyes that still glistened under thick lashes, a bright face that neither sagged nor sank. His skin, a firm Sicilian fawn in the coldest months, was burnished to a fine copper hue after a long summer of early morning runs and late afternoon beers. Not once, not even for a second, had he forgotten the name of his best friend, or for that matter, what to call the kitchen utensil he was just then holding in his hand. Paul had been a graduate school long enough to know that the first rule of being a graduate student, at least a graduate student in the humanities and the soft social sciences, was that one must always insist on the horrors of quaternary education. It must be nice, people like to say, when they heard how Paul spent his days, as though getting a PhD were like taking an extended beach vacation in Bali. And who could blame them? Anytime grad students featured in a book or a TV show, their occupation tended to serve as a placeholder, an excuse to let a character wander around the city all day, thinking deep thoughts, or doing expensive drugs, or having complicated polyamorous affairs, without the narrative drag of a job or other ordinary adult responsibilities. No, it's not like that, Paul was supposed to say. Grad school's not like that at all. He knew the whole spiel. He could rattle it off without thinking. The work was limitless. The hours were awful. The pay was atrocious. The stress was enormous. The whole system ran on bureaucratic caprice and professorial whim. And now there were no jobs on the other side of the gauntlet to redeem all that torment. Possibly you could justify grad school in the name of pluperfect desire, which was to say that for some people it was, like chemotherapy or learning German, something worth wanting to have done. But no one in their right mind looked forward to actually doing it. To complete a PhD in the humanities, after all, was to forfeit the best decade of your life to a state of quasi-monastic abstention, to spend years writing a thesis that 10 people in the world would understand, and 4 people in the world would ever read. To take on a small nation's worth of student debt, and to come out of it at the end, if you're lucky, with a degree of such mind-boggling inutility that it would make you less employable than you were when you started. And yet for all his very real gripes, for all that he spent most of his time feeling unripe and overspent, somehow simultaneously both wet behind the ears and past his prime, Paul also often felt like the luckiest person on earth. The secret was that he loved being a graduate student, loved it so much that he sometimes wondered if being a graduate student was in fact his true calling in life. This was absurd, of course, he understood that. The point of graduate school was that you weren't supposed to stay forever. The idea was to take your courses, do your exams, write your dissertation, and then 5 or 10 or 100 years later, to get on with your life. But Paul didn't want to get on. He didn't want to leave. Okay, this next bit is about Renata and Adrian. This is, I should say that the chapters rotate, so each chapter is from the perspective of one of those 3 characters. It goes Paul, Renata, Warren. So this is kind of told from Renata's perspective. The other thing I should say that doesn't really come up in this passage is that one of the things about the glow, which is what comes to be called the Nimbus, is that not everyone can see it. Some people can, some people can't. Paul can see it, Adrian can see it, Warren can see it, but Renata cannot. And so much of the kind of angst that she has throughout the novel comes from the fact that she sort of has to rely on everyone to tell her what's going on with her son. She can't see this. But this is still before she actually has any encounter with the Nimbus. Renata had fallen in love with Adrian over email during the course of a long-distance correspondence that started after they spent an evening together and then spent the night together at a wedding of mutual friends. She'd been flattered by his easy charm, impressed by the obscurity of his interests, and drawn to the warm fluency of his conversations. He was likable, but not cloying, funny, but not obnoxious, at once sincere and ironic, in an Gen X sort of way. A decade older than she was, he knew a lot about a lot, and obviously loved learning, but he wasn't a prick about it. He wasn't uptight. Not much seemed to get under his skin. Renata liked his looks too, which answered a primordial fantasy involving beaches and lifeguards that she'd carried around since she was a girl. She also liked it when he had sworn early on, unprompted and with evident honesty, that she was the most beautiful woman he'd ever dated. But what had really taken her, intimidated her really, albeit in an intensely attractive way, was the depth of feeling and intensity of resolve she found waiting under his veneer of SoCal disaffection. Though she felt very old at the time, Renata was not yet 30 when she and Adrian started trading long emails after their wedding rendezvous. He was nearing 40 and working as an adjunct in Ohio with no visible prospect for improvement. No one wanted to hire him. No one wanted to publish him. Even his first lucky break, which would come when a senior scholar at Indiana University happened upon his dissertation and invited him to apply for a tenure-track job, was still hiding up ahead in the unseeable future. Yet none of these setbacks had defeated Adrian's ironclad self-assurance. At Harvard, Renata had known plenty of would-be future presidents, corporate titans, and Pulitzer Prize winners, all of them as exasperating as they were confident they were headed for world historical renown. Adrian shared their sense of a grand personal destiny, but in him it was both complicated and intensified by the belief that he nearly missed his chance. He was certain that he'd wasted a precious bolus of time in his 20s, certain too that the soulless debasements of late imperial America had conspired to keep him from discovering his vocation in religious studies until it was almost too late. In his own half-ironic telling, by the time he started his PhD at the ripe old age of 29, he was as desperate for redemption as any sinner in the hands of an angry God. Feeling herself substantially adrift in the doldrums of post-collegiate life, Renata had felt an immediate attraction to Adrian's purpose and drive. She admired the way he never let his feelings of belatedness get him down, the way he used them, in fact, as a spur to his ambitions. Most of all, she was impressed and not a little envious, that he seemed to know exactly what he wanted to achieve and exactly what he needed to do to achieve it. A decade later, Renata could identify more than a few things that she'd gotten wrong with her future husband. She could only laugh at herself for ever believing him free of neuroses, for example, and especially for imagining that his fondness for hippie rock was a prophylactic against, rather than an expression of, an abiding psychological unease. It was also true that what she'd once taken for his impossibly comprehensive erudition had far more gaps, holes, and blind spots than she'd ever suspected. In several areas, in fact, including modern history, 20th century art and literature, and music by any composer or band you couldn't see at a summer festival drowning in tie-dye, she had known far more at 25 than he did, even now. It was also the case that the rigors of parenting Max and Luca had taken Adrian, as they had taken Renata, completely by surprise. They talked about this a lot, so much that it sometimes seemed it was their only real subject of conversation anymore. How nothing in their lives, not their families, not their friends, not their acquaintances, not the culture at large, had prepared them for the unrelenting effort required to raise small children. Renata had, of course, appreciated that motherhood in general would be difficult. She was not the sort of woman who needed the Atlantic to tell her that having it all, whatever that was supposed to mean, was a ludicrous fantasy. She felt she'd been adequately informed about the ways infancy would be a strange and taxing time for her mind, body, and sanity. But she was staggered utterly, as Adrian was, to discover how hard parenthood got after that, once both her boys were no longer babies. Why had no one told them it was going to be like this? Why had no one warned them that they would be giving up not only the ability to go to a movie on a rainy weeknight or to fool around on a lazy Sunday morning, but whole swaths of what they had taken to be ordinary existence? They'd been interesting people once, they reminded each other. Interesting people with interesting friends and fascinations and hobbies. They'd listened to new music and read old books. They'd thrown parties. They'd gone dancing. They'd enjoyed the fizzy delights of spontaneous conversation and the deep pleasures of solitary thought. They believed, and had reason to believe, that it was possible not to be tired. And now they had nothing but their boys. Hello, Renata here.
Oh, it's so good. I love the section to read. Oh my goodness. And we were talking about this before we started. I have a toddler. So reading this book and reading those sections, I was like, yes, I have no time. I'm tired all the time. My bag is full of treats and other snacks and diapers. So you captured toddler life very well. So I want to start out by asking you the question that I think all writers get asked, which is, what first drew you to this conceptually? Like, are you drawn by character, by plot, by theme? Like, what made you decide this is going to be my debut novel?
Yeah, I mean, I kind of, for a long time, so I spent my 20s in graduate school, and I swore to myself for most of that I was never going to write an academic novel. And what changed my mind, I think, was two things. One was the experience of being a parent. The book is not autobiographical in the sense that I don't know any glowing children. But that passage in particular, I think, does get at one of the things that I pulled from real life, which, you know, I have a 12 and a 10-year-old, and really when they hit that age, again, I was kind of ready for them to be babies, and I understood what that would be about. But for those of you who are parents may know, there's just this kind of black hole period that happens before they get to kindergarten. And I just really was like, wait, what happened? And why did no one tell me about this? And why wasn't I ready for it? And I didn't see it represented in a lot of places in fiction. I mean, I think I started writing this book in 2018. Right around then, we were getting a wave of really great books particularly about motherhood and having new babies and having infants. But again, like the next kind of the next phase I didn't see very much. So that was part of it. And then also, as Rose said, I went to divinity school. I spent 10 years. I grew up Catholic. Kind of thought I'd like settled my depth with religion. I was like, I gotta figure out what I need to figure out. It's great. Like, spent a lot of time thinking about Dante and other things in graduate school. But as time went on, I realized that like those questions did not actually go away. Couldn't quite keep them stuffed away in the way that I wanted to. And I think a little bit like the parenting thing, in some parts of American culture, people talk about religion all the time and it's present. But certainly in like my circles, it was just not around. It was pretty invisible. And that was interesting to me in part because sometimes you get a hint from somebody who's like, oh yeah, I was at church last week. And like, oh wait, you go to church. Or they'd say something that would kind of, be like, wait a second. But it was never a subject of direct attention. And I thought that was interesting that, again, it's not for everybody around the world or in this country, but certainly for a certain segment of people, I think like we've just kind of taken religion off the table, even if it's quite meaningful to people in their lives. And I wanted to talk about it. So I was trying to figure out like how could I bring those two things together.
Love that. And one thing that's really fascinating about this novel is it's really funny. And I don't think you would necessarily assume that a book about religion or that's exploring questions of belief and meaning and systems in grad school. So how did you approach talking about such important, sometimes heavy topics, but making sure that it still keeps that lighthearted tone?
Yeah.
From a process perspective.
So again, I grew up Catholic. I had a very intense Catholic phase in college, as John and Ashley know. They my friends up here, who probably dragged a lot of you here. And I think that because religion is so important to a lot of people, you often end up having a kind of like sentimentality that attaches to the ways people discuss it. And I just felt like I was done with that. I didn't want to have a kind of sentimental approach to it. I feel like there's a lot of things that we know about, the history of religions, about the way that religious people conduct themselves in private or whatever. And I wasn't ready to just say, oh, that's not important because this whole thing is important to me. So I kind of wanted to push down all that on the table. Let's just say, like, what do we got here? Like, what's left? And what can we figure out from this whole thing? And again, the book it's not a proselytizing book. It doesn't end up with any answers for you. So if you're looking for that, it's not going to give you it. But I did kind of just want to say, like, let's talk about this stuff. And I think inevitably, a lot of it's really funny. And, religions insist on taking themselves very seriously often. And I don't think that we're obligated to follow them down that path. I think that one of the great things about living in 2025 is that we can sort of have that freedom to laugh at things that are funny, treat it the way that we want to.
I love that. I was reading a lot of the early reviews and press about the book, and a lot of people are talking about it as a book about belief, which I think is true.
Mm-hmm.
But what stood out to me in reading was how much also talked about ambition and ego and how much it's really circling Adrian. Can you speak to how those things maybe developed in him as a character and how that's so inseparable from his perception of religion in the book? Yeah.
So as you heard from one of the passages, Adrian got kind of a late start in his academic career, but also had this real sense of like a personal destiny and feels like he's losing time. And I think that sense of losing time is only heightened by, he's definitely not a 50-50 parent, but even the amount of parenting he is doing, I think makes him feel like he's slipping even further behind. And so without giving too much away, he gets really interested in the Nimbus, and it's not for altruistic kind of innocent reasons always. He kind of sees this like, oh, this might be my thing. And, I think that to me felt kind of natural within the story. But I also think that it speaks to how religion functions in the world too. I mean, I think, in the Middle Ages, it was just common that if you were the second-born son of a family, you would go into the church because you weren't the person who's going to inherit everything. So if you had any kind of ambition, like your path to power was through the church. And I think we don't have it quite as directly now, but I think for a lot of people there is that. So again, I wanted to kind of not treat religion as just like this pristine, innocent, sentimental thing, but let's talk about the ways in which it's used by people for their own ends, which might not be particularly selfless or whatever.
Right. And I felt like that was such a powerful part of the book because it does speak to control and power and perception in the way that what we perceive can be manipulated for personal gain. And you just really can't separate that from talking about religious institutions anywhere throughout history, I think.
Yeah.
Are you a writer who writes by theme? You know, like, do you feel like you are circling a question? Is there something that you're trying to investigate, or does the theme ebb and flow as the plot develops for you?
I think it's a great question. I think I start with a set of questions which are kind of a theme, as I was saying before, but then I try pretty quickly to like make those concrete and figure out like what's the story I want to tell. And pretty quickly, I want the story to drive the writing, because I think if the theme is present too much in your mind, then you start making excuses for what you're putting on the page, because you're saying, oh, this is answering to this idea I have, or this is like, I'm trying to answer this question. But again, like, as you'll see if you read it, it's a story that things are happening to people, and for that to be, I think, a good and compelling read, that really has to be the logic that's driving the story. It can't be answering to something that I have in the back of my head. Obviously, I hope when I'm done, I've worked on some of that stuff, but for me, it's like a starting point, and then I pretty quickly try to make it concrete.
I love that. And I mean, and it was clear in reading that it's the characters that drive the plot, which is, I think, that's my favorite way to read a book, is when the character is first. And the plot is not forced, but it's clearly driven by their desires, their fears, all of the background work that you've clearly done. I am curious how you landed on the three perspectives that we have here. We don't go into Luca's perspective, and we don't go into Adrian's. And what drew you to these three in particular to braid the story together? Yeah,
that's another great question. I mean, I had thought a lot about who was going to be able to see the Nimbus, and I'd also thought a lot about who was going to glow. Initially, it wasn't clear to me that the boy was going to glow. I toyed with the idea of maybe Adrian would glow, but I realized that I didn't want it to happen to somebody who could talk about it. So even though Luca's 2 years old, his speech delayed, and so he's not talking at the time. Because I didn't want to put a thumb on the scale and say this is what it means. A lot of the book is about people trying to figure out what's actually going on with this kid, and they don't start out thinking it's religious. They start out thinking it's medical. They rush him off to the hospital, do a bunch of tests. So I realized that, like, just narratively, I didn't want to force the issue. I wanted to make sure that that was a mystery.
And Renata, I'm so glad you read from her. She's one of my favorite characters. I mean, I just love seeing complicated portrayals of motherhood, and she's kind of a complicated character. She has anger, coming into her experience, which I think a lot of moms resonate with, especially father moms. They're just tired, they're angry, they're brittle, sometimes their careers have been on hold, and there's just so much to her characterization. So I'm wondering if you can talk us through your process of really fleshing out her character, because the marriage is really at the center of the family conflict through the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at my life as I'm 47 years old, I feel like we're kind of, my micro generation is about halfway through the feminist revolution. So it's not what it was for my parents' age, where like the dads did very little of the house care and everything, but it's also clearly not 50-50 yet. And it's kind of hard to see that because it takes different forms. Every family is different. Everybody has a different relationship, whatever. But especially I think we saw it with COVID, right? People's relationships between parents shifted, and people's relationships to their kids shifted. But once I kind of saw this, I was like, oh, it's kind of an interesting time to be like midway, where some things are better, and I think Renata can tell herself that some things are better, and she can tell herself, like, Adrian's not a bad guy, he's not a bad husband, like he like makes dinner and helps out around the house somewhat.
That's the bare minimum.
Yeah,
I will call it what it is.
Yeah, but she can tell herself, like, oh, it's better than I expected, right? But at the same time, especially as things ramp up with the Nimbus, she finds herself left with more and more. And I should say part of it is that, like, their dilemma is, how much can we get back to normal life? And how soon can we get back to normal? I think Adrian's much more eager to be like, okay, I think things are kind of fine. Like, let's, I need to like get back to my teaching, my work. We like put it on hold for a couple of weeks, but it's time to like get going again. And she's like, but this crazy thing is happening to our kid. What are you talking about? We can't possibly do that. And so that, it doesn't feel to me like a super visible tension, but it's one that I recognize like in my own life and the people around me, you know, that we're all kind of living without it being named. So that was interesting.
That's exactly what I loved about it, because the tension between the two of them was often so mundane. It was like, hey, our childcare fell through. What are we gonna do about it? Like, that is such a real conflict that happens in households that is very rarely portrayed in fiction. So the fact that you were showing these ordinary moments, you know, that are obviously affected by the extraordinary within Nimbus, I thought was a really beautiful part of the book.
That was great.
So before we go to audience questions, I wanted to go back to what you said at the very beginning about the current state of things and the importance of writing, and the importance of just telling the truth, right? And one of my favorite parts of the book, I think, really speaks to that, which is on page 69. I'll read it.
Yeah, please. Good.
Of course, it was true that the answers people found in religion were often terrible. Chief among them, the answer that said that the demands of heaven overruled any ordinary claims of human solidarity. That was how you got Isaac on the rock. That was how you got the Crusades. That was how you got burning witches and kamikaze monks and pedophile protecting churches. It's also how we get a lot of other things, I think. Yet the bad answers were also in their way beside the point. As long as there was longing, there would be disappointment. As long as there was love, there would be heartbreak. And as long as there was life, there would be death. I underline that. It's pretty early in the book, page 69, and it's one of my favorite you can speak to that grammatically, what you think that's saying.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is going to sound like a little bit of a digression, but those of you who are roughly my age will remember kind of this new atheism movement that came through in the 2000s, Chris Rage and that sort of Richard Dawkins. And I think that there was a real sense that this kind of terrible metaphor, I'm sorry, but like religion was like this like corpse of something that was like sitting on the edge of a cliff and it just needed one good kick and we were actually good. And like there's this real sense of just like, okay, we can give it up now, we can stop like fooling ourselves, like let's just be done with it finally. And what was interesting to me, obviously, because I was at divinity school and because I've been raised Catholic, was that it didn't really take. Like they were very assertive. They were all over the place. They were on TV. They were making these arguments quite loudly. But like everyone's kind of like, yeah, but there's something else. Like there's something that like we can't quite do without. And I was kind of interested in that. So that passage is like trying to reconcile, I think, or at least lay out what I see as the dilemma, which is the one that we know all these things, that terrible things that religion do. We can say, whatever we want to say about the history of particular faiths, but we still have these questions, and we still have to talk to our children, like what happens when you die, what happens to grandma or to whoever, and so those questions don't go away. And that to me is just like the interesting phenomenon. Again, I wish I had answers to give you, but
Our search for meaning and for goodness doesn't go away, even when terrible things are. This book illuminates that for us. Unintended. Well, we're going to open it up for some questions. I will hand the microphone over to Ro.
All right, if we have a question, just throw a hand up. Oh, I was gonna say, I have a comment.
yeah.
I had never written a PhD dissertation. I also never written a novel. Feels like there may be some similarities between the two processes, and I'm wondering if you can contrast the two, Bob, and also now that you are through this, I'm wondering if you ever want to go through it again.
Both very good questions. I never want to write a dissertation again. I can promise you that. Yeah, I mean the lifestyle for both can feel very similar in that they're kind of always on your mind. You can't, I'm a morning person. I try to write in the mornings and early afternoons. I try to give myself very like clean and crisp hours when I'm working so that I don't just carry around all the time. But the truth is, you're always thinking about it. And this was true of the dissertation too, but especially with the novel, there's a weird way in which when you're working on it, it becomes kind of stagnant for everything in your life. So you become very dangerous at parties and among friends because you're like, oh, that's gonna go on the book. Or if you're coming sniffing on the train, you know, it's like coming down the train, someone behind you is talking to them. That's a great piece of dialogue. Borrow that and use that somewhere. The difference is, I would say, you know, scholarly work really has to answer to some kind of rigor. And there's rigor in fiction writing, but it's a very different kind of rigor. For me, fiction is really about freedom. Like, there's a lot of kind of structural rigor that you need to figure out, and the form is important, but you can really do anything you want. I mean, you can make a child glow, you know? And for me, it's just like, in some ways, worlds away, even though they do feel like books. I do want to write another novel. I think I'm gonna write this.
So, and next question. I don't know what your confirmation name was, first of all.
David.
Right. I grew up Catholic in outside Chicago.
Oh, there you go.
Yeah, so I was wondering, I know you said that this wasn't that autobiographical,
Yeah.
but a divinity school in the south side of Chicago. Is there any building from UC that I would recognize its likeness to your book?
Yeah, I mean, my rule for myself, speaking of rigor, was that the closer I got to the USC, the more I would try to make it different than actual reality. And then the further away things got geographically, they kind of had to be more realistic. But yes, I mean, if you go to the divinity school at Chicago and go to Swift Hall, and you will recognize and see there's this chapel called Bond Chapel, which has some very pertinent differences in the book. But like, if you see it and you walk around, you'd be like, oh yeah, that's what I sold at. So again, but that it also felt me like the magpie sort of thing. I did want to give myself enough freedom to say, you know what, I'm gonna like make it different here because I did want to be. There's this famous thing about James Joyce that when he was writing his Dubliners or Ulysses or something, that like he wanted somebody 100 years later to be able to like know what it was like to walk around Dublin that year. Every street had to be exactly right. Every building had to be exactly right. And I didn't like it. So. Yeah.
So you talked about the concepts, that the themes you wanted to address, and did those all? I'm assuming that's something you've been gnawing on since divinity school and everything else. Yeah. When did you realize those concepts and the medium of a novel were going to come together? How much before you actually put pen to paper, so to speak? Yeah. Did you sort of like just sit on those concepts?
Right. No, it's a great question, and I do think a lot about form, but the honest truth is that I wanted to write a novel. So I that was like also very present in my mind. I wasn't looking for like, oh, I've got this idea. Should it be an epic poem, or should it be a TV show, or should it be something else? Yeah. I don't know. Yeah. So
it came self-formed in your own mind.
No, nothing came self-formed, but that particular choice was made. And then it was like, so then how do I make this a readable novel? And that was like important to me because, again, I think I didn't want. I just know that like when you tell people you're writing about religion, a lot of people are like, really? And I wanted it to be fun. I wanted it to be interesting. I wanted to like kind of pull you through. I mean, I will say there's a lot of weird, odd digressions, but they don't last too long, hopefully. So there's like a lot of there's a lot of ideas in the book, but it's not a novel of ideas in the sense that like, again, the book's not trying to make you believe in those ideas, but a huge part of being in graduate school is like you live with these ideas, kind of just you're walking around like a backpack, you know, and it's really that kind of absent-minded professor thing starts pretty young for grad students. Like I've definitely had moments where you're like walking around thinking about saying gospel, you look up and there's a brick wall right here, you know. So I wanted to kind of get some of that feeling where like you're not normal. You're not normal in the sense that like you're thinking about some weird obscure member of parliament and in the middle of the day on Tuesday. And that's just kind of how that life is. So
how much does it change? I mean, you start writing in 2018,
yeah.
Right? I assume you have a story outline, you're kind of ready to go.
Yeah.
How long did it take you to write the book?
It was 6 years front to back.
Yeah. A long time. So how much does that change in your mind throughout the story you're writing?
The story changed quite a bit. I mean, obviously we lived through something pretty big time during that, and it had a lot to do with how I thought about parenthood. My wife was here, Jesse, back there. She's a doctor, and when COVID hit, she was at, like unlike a lot of people, she was at the hospital every day. So I got the kids when school shut down. We had like 2 weeks of very successful Papa school where I was doing the whole like orbits of the planets with fruit and all of that. And then like from about 2 weeks on, like it started to create up very rapidly. It got very difficult. So yeah, that gave me, stuff to think about. I find myself like going over the beginning of the book a lot. The first 6 chapters took a long time to kind of get just right before I could move on. But once I got about 2/3 of the way through, I was able to be like, okay, I can see where this is going. So it's hard to say like something's changed a lot.
Yeah,
It's a long time. Yeah. So,
Yeah, and one of the things that stays compelling for me through the whole novel is it's as simple as just the glowing child. Because I was thinking about reading it, this history of narratives of miracles.
Yeah.
And it seems like they're the ones that transform something, like someone is healed.
Yeah.
Or something has changed. And then there are the ones that are just sort of, feel counterfactual or supernatural, like, stones float or,
Right.
those sort of those
Right.
miracles. And this is sort of more of that in that line, like it doesn't change anything. It's not a light you can do anything with or even read by. It's just there. So that seems like such a great choice as far as the ways in which the characters and their interpretations have to kind of, constellate around that. And I'm wondering if that was there from the very beginning, the glowing child.
Yeah, I mean, it took me a little bit to hit on what kind of. I knew I wanted something supernatural to happen. I'll tell you the thing that really drew me to it was I knew I didn't want to have a miracle that would imply a certain faith tradition. So you can't do like the stigmata because that reads as Christian. You can't do whatever it be, something that would read as, something from Islam or something from Judaism, whatever. So that all of a sudden like cuts out a bunch of things. And then I kind of had this realization that like glowing as a symbol of holiness actually shows up in all kinds of faith traditions. Nimbus is really a term from art history. So it's a name for any kind of halo or full body glow or any sort of thing. But, in like Indian art, it shows up as flames often. In Christian art, you're used to the halo like this, but there's often like full body halos. It's all over the place. And so that was part of it. Was I didn't want it to take a form that everybody would say in the book would say, oh yeah, well that's a Christian thing in the way that we would expect it to be. Like the Virgin Mary is floating down the way that she did it. It needed to be something that resisted giving you the answer because I wanted to people figure out what this is. Yeah. All right. Oh, yeah.
So I was wondering, I know you're so smart and you know a lot of this off the top of your head. You've been one of my more brilliant friends. But I wondered if there's like pieces where it's sort of like the sentence you read, where I would have needed to research for 2 years just to make those like 5 historical references. And so I wondered, like, did you get stuck on stuff like that? Like, am I saying it right? Am I doing it right? Do I need to stop and do some research? And then also, did you do that sort of more like heady writing and then come back and then throw in like the sex scene later on? Or
Yeah.
and there
are techniques.
there is that. And was it, or did that like really flow like that? Like that was writing, you were like serious, and then you were like, and now we'll go into the bedroom,
Yeah.
That much stuff.
Yeah.
But there is
Yeah. Okay. That's a good question. I did take a lot of notes when I was in grad school because I knew I wanted to be a writer then. So I had journals that I could go back and look through and be like, oh, this is kind of this weird thing. So I'd often go back and fill that out. Or I'd say like, oh, here's 2 things. There's a lot of lists in the book. I like lists, but there's a lot of lists in the book. So I'd be like, here's 2 or 3 things. Like, how can I make this a list of 6 or 7 things? And then you start looking things up. And the internet's, of course, great for that. The second part of your question, I tend to write like 800 to 1,000 word chunks. So I think I would like only work on like a heavy thing that day and not a sex scene in the same day. But they could easily happen in the same week. Like I try to give myself little assignments each day because if I just go in with no idea of what I'm doing, then I often end up wasting the day. So it's like, okay, today we're going to get from like point A to point B and then tomorrow it's B to C. So I could kind of sketch ahead, like, what do I need? And like, I've just done this really heady scene. Now I need to like bring it back to earth and have like the kid playing on the floor, or whatever it is. So, yes.
I did feel like I learned stuff like the dictionary,
Yeah.
whole section. That was so cool. We should talk about
So
that.
yeah, so this is something I learned in grad school. There's a guy from the Middle Ages named John of Garland who is responsible for the word dictionary. He's the reason why we have the word dictionary. He wrote a book called the Dictionarius. He was a teacher at the University of Paris in the 12th century, I think. And the deal at the University of Paris in the 12th century, if you were coming to study theology, which is what most people came to study, and I think other subjects too, was you had to speak Latin all the time. And we think of like the Middle Ages as a Latin period, but really people would come from the countryside speaking their own little vernacular. And, you know, they'd have to come and speak the learned language of Latin. Oftentimes they had no idea how to do that. And they were pretty young too. They'd be like 13 or 14. And so what he did is really kind of charming in this way. He wrote this little like guidebook, basically to like help them understand all the words. Just like, what do all the things in your life, how do you say those words in Latin? And so he basically takes the reader on this like kind of tour around medieval Paris, and he shows you everything in his house and like his, you know, the tableware and the stuff in his closet and all of that. He goes outside, he walks, shows you all of his neighbors who are sharing stuff. And then he has these like funny little asides, like don't buy meat from those guys because they like to rip off the young scholars. And like those women are called the cleanup women, are actually prostitutes and that kind of stuff. And so it's like meant to be a guy, you know, just like what we would think of as like a foreign language guide. But the book was called the Dictionarius, and that's the reason why we have dictionaries. That word just transferred through time. So anyway, there's a little riff on that in the book.
All right, anybody else? Something that's been burning in here? Alrighty, y'all, thank you
Thank you guys so much for coming out.
I'm gonna move this podium out, and then Robert, if you would like to,
Yeah,
we're gonna
happy
sign
to
some
sign books,
books
yeah.
over here.
Yep.
And we have the Nimbus for purchase in the front if you'd like. We also have the Ciera's book if you're interested in checking that out. Yeah, thank you all so much for being here.
Thanks for that. Hey, thank you.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we started in